something begins to move through the sky, not with thunder, not with the violence of storm or the blaze of lightning. Something smaller, something that travels on 8 legs, carrying behind it a bundle wrapped in silk, and inside that bundle, the impossible. A python, coiled and still, a leopard, bound and furious, a hollow gourd sealed tight, vibrating with the hum of 10,000 hornets, and in a small clay pot, something old and wild and barely containable, a forest spirit known as Moatia, a being that no creature had ever held. The spider climbs. Before him, the house of Nyame, god of the sky, sovereign of heaven, the being who kept every story that had ever been told, locked away at the edge of the world. Anansi had been promised those stories, and he had come to collect. Welcome to Aeonkeep, where the ancient legends live. Today, the story of Anansi, the spider of Asante tradition, who bargained with the god of the sky and won ownership of every story in the world. The Asante people of what is now Ghana have been telling stories about Anansi for centuries, and no one can say exactly how long. He is among the most ancient figures in Akan oral tradition, a tradition that breathed and lived in the telling long before any outside scholar thought to write it down. In the Akan worldview, the cosmos is presided over by Nyame, a supreme deity, remote and sovereign, who governs from the sky. Below him moves a host of divine intermediaries, the Obosum, spiritual forces inhabiting rivers, great trees, and sacred places. And somewhere in this cosmology, occupying a position that resists easy categorization, sits Anansi. He is spider. He is also a man. He moves between worlds, between forms, between what is permitted and what is not. Some traditions name him a son of Nyame himself. All of them name him the trickster. Among the Akan people, stories are not simply entertainment. They are tools of survival, vessels of wisdom, ways of encoding truth in a form that travels across generations without losing its shape. The Akan name for the whole tradition of these stories, Anansesum, means literally spider stories. Not because Anansi invented them, because he owns them. This is how that came to be. The sky god Nyame possessed something beyond price. Every story in the world, every tale ever spoken around a fire, every riddle, every warning, every account of the first things and the last, they were his, locked away, and the world below lived in a kind of poverty that it barely knew to name. Anansi went to him. He climbed the silk threads of the upper air, entered Nyame's presence, and made his request plainly. He wanted to buy the stories. Nyame looked down at the small brown spider before him and considered the request with something between amusement and the absolute certainty of a god who knows the mathematics of the impossible. His price was not gold. It was not sacrifice. It was 4 things that no creature had ever successfully captured, because no creature had ever been clever enough to try. Onini, the great python, whose body was longer than any river is wide and faster than water over stone. Osebo, the leopard, whose paws left craters in soft earth and whose eyes burned like 2 small suns in the dark. The Moboro, a swarm of hornets whose anger had never been contained by anything made of hands. And Moatia, a forest spirit of the deepest bush, who was seen only when she chose to be seen and who had never once been held. Any one of these would have defeated a warrior. All four together were meant to be a polite refusal, the shape of a closed door dressed up as an open one. Anansi went home and told Aso what Nyame had demanded. When he had finished speaking, he sat by the hearth and stared at the floor. A python, a leopard, a swarm of hornets, a spirit of the deep bush that no creature had ever held. It was, he said, finished. Nyame had set a price he knew could not be paid. Aso did not agree. She was his sharpest weapon, not because she was fearless or reckless, but because she understood what the spider understood only in his better moments, that every creature has a shape to its pride, and that shape, if you know it, can be used against it. Between them, over the nights that followed, she drew the blueprint for each trap. He went first to Onini. He walked through the long grass until he found the great python resting in a broad coil across the roots of an old tree, and he began, quite audibly, to have an argument with himself. He muttered and rebutted and contradicted back and forth, wrestling with a question that seemed to give him no peace. When Onini finally asked what troubled him, Anansi explained. He and his wife had disagreed about whether Onini was really as long as the palm branch Anansi was carrying. His wife said no. Anansi believed yes. Could Onini not simply settle the matter, lie alongside this branch so that Anansi could measure? Vanity is a vulnerability in every living creature. Onini, who had never doubted his own magnificence, stretched himself alongside the branch willingly, and Anansi, loop by careful loop, bound him to it. Next came the Momoboro. Anansi arrived at the hornet's tree, carrying a large empty gourd and a broad leaf held above his head like a small roof. He poured water over himself, over the gourd, over the nest, and he called out in a voice of warm and generous concern. Rain, great rain is falling. Come inside the gourd quickly before you are soaked through. The hornets, trusting what they heard over what they might have considered, flew into the gourd. Anansi sealed it with moss and walked away. Osebo the leopard required a different kind of thinking. Anansi dug a pit along the path where the leopard walked at night, covering it carefully until no eye could distinguish the trap from solid ground. In the darkness, Osebo fell through. By morning he was pacing the bottom, furious and humiliated, two states that in leopards tend to reinforce each other. Anansi appeared at the rim at first light. He did not mock. He did not offer rescue. He carried something in his hands, and the leopard, who had never once imagined himself in the position of the hunted, learned in that pit why the old stories counsel such particular caution about the spider. Osebo did not leave the pit the way he had entered it, but he was delivered to Nyame. Momoatia was the most delicate problem. The forest spirit was ancient and suspicious, and entirely without the kind of vanity that had undone Onini. She moved through the deep bush on her own terms, and she could not be chased or cornered or convinced. She could perhaps be offended. Anansi carved a small wooden figure, shaped with care, painted, given the posture of a person at rest, and coated it with the sticky sap drawn from a forest tree. He set it beneath the odum tree where Moatia was known to walk, and beside it he placed a bowl of yam as an offering. Moatia came. She found the food and ate. She spoke to the figure, offering her thanks as politeness required. The figure said nothing. This was to Moatia a profound insult. She struck the figure, and her hand held fast. She struck again with the other, and that held too. She kicked, and then she was truly caught, all 4 limbs locked in the sap. The forest spirit who had never been held found herself held by a doll and a spider and the oldest trick in the world, the one that uses pride as its mechanism. Anansi brought them all to Nyame. The python, coiled and bound to his branch, the hornets humming inside their sealed gourd, the leopard subdued, the forest spirit still struggling. Nyame looked at what the spider had laid before him. He was, above everything else, a god of his word. And so he called together the assembled beings of sky and earth, and he spoke clearly. From this day forward, his sky stories would be called spider stories. They belonged now to Kwaku Anansi, to the spider. Not one story, carefully selected. Not a portion measured out. All of them. Everything that had ever been told, or would ever be told. The wisdom of the first days and the riddles of the last. The accounts of heroes and the warnings of fools. They were now the spiders. And it is for this reason that the old people say, if you want a story, you must first ask Anansi. If the story ended there, in the court of the sky, it would be a monument to cleverness, a small creature outwitting a god, and the world rearranged as a consequence. But Anansi's stories do not stay in the sky. They sink down into the ground where the people are, and they follow the people wherever the people are forced to go. Centuries later, when the slave ships crossed the Atlantic with their terrible cargo of human lives, the stories traveled too. Enslaved Akan and Akan adjacent people carried Anansi with them into the holds of those ships, across the Middle Passage, and into the new world of the Caribbean and the Americas. In Jamaica, he became Anansi. In the Dutch-speaking Caribbean, he remained Anansi. On the American mainland, his shadow moved through other stories, another small creature, outwitting every larger thing that came for it. Though his name was changed and his origins were buried. The apparatus of chattel slavery was designed to strip a human being of everything: their name, their land, their language, their gods. In much of this, it succeeded. The deliberate separation of linguistic groups, the suppression of drums and sacred assemblies, the systematic violence of the seasoning process, these left enormous silences in the archive of West African culture, silences that can never be fully recovered. But Anansi endured. Not because oral tradition is inherently invulnerable, it is not. He endured because the people who carried him refused, at immense personal cost, to let him die. They told the stories in the dark, in the spaces between surveillance, encoding them in new forms for a brutal new world. The spider survived because the people who owned his stories chose not to stop telling them. The Anansi stories belong to an oral tradition of the Akan peoples of West Africa, centered primarily among the Asante of present-day Ghana, though Anansi figures appear across multiple Akan-speaking communities. Because this tradition was oral, there is no ancient text in the way that the Iliad or the Epic of Gilgamesh, survives in written form. The earliest stories were carried in human memory and in the living act of telling. The most significant early scholarly collection in English is R.S. Rattray's Akan Ashanti Folk Tales, published in 1930. Rattray, a British colonial officer who became an ethnographer and linguist, recorded stories directly from Asante storytellers, often preserving the original Twi alongside his English translations. His collection remains a foundational reference, though it must be read with clear eyes. It was produced within a colonial framework that shaped what was recorded, how it was translated, and what was considered worthy of preservation. The stories Rattray collected are not the tradition in its entirety. They are a partial record of an oral world far larger than any written archive. The story of how Anansi purchased the stories from Nyame is among the most widely told in the tradition and appears in Rattray's collection in a form close to the version recounted here. The four creatures, Onini, Osebo, the Moboro, and Moatia, are consistent across recorded versions, though the specific mechanics of each capture vary between tellers, as is proper in a living oral tradition. It is worth noting that the version of Osebo's capture most familiar to modern English language readers, in which a bent sapling catapults the leopard from a pit into a waiting net, derives primarily from Gail E. Haley's 1970 picture book, A Story, and not from Rattray or the older oral sources. In the older recorded tradition, Anansi's resolution of the pit trap is considerably more final. The script reflects the older tradition. Moatia deserve a particular note. In Akan belief, they are forest spirits, supernatural beings of the deep bush, and are not straightforwardly dwarfs in the Western fairy tale sense, though they are frequently translated as such in English language sources. The wooden figure coated in sticky sap that catches Moatia is also, scholars of folklore have argued, the origin of the tar baby story type that appears across the American South and the Caribbean, a narrative form that traveled with enslaved Africans and survived, transformed in new cultural soil. Anansi's own nature sits at a cosmological threshold. He is described in some traditions as a son of Nyame, which makes this story not simply a commercial transaction, but something closer to a family negotiation, a child bargaining with a parent for inheritance. This dimension of the myth is not always foregrounded in popular retellings, but is present in the tradition and gives the story a different kind of weight. Every myth has a heartbeat, a pulse of human truth that keeps it alive long after the civilization that first told it has changed beyond recognition. Anansi's heartbeat is one of the most radical propositions in all of world mythology. It is not the strong who own the stories. It is the clever. It is not the god who keeps them. In the end, the god gives them away to the smallest creature that came asking. In a world structured entirely by power, by size, by force, by divine authority, Anansi offers a different theorem. That narrative is the ultimate resource, that whoever holds the story holds the meaning of everything else. That a spider with the right words at the right moment is more powerful than a leopard, a python, a swarm of hornets, and a forest spirit combined. He caught 4 impossible things through 4 separate acts of imagination. and then he was given the world. The question the story leaves open is the one every generation must answer for itself. Who is telling the stories now? The spider still spins. Somewhere, in the dark between one age and another, Anansi is waiting, patient as only a creature who owns every story can afford to be. He has time. He has all the time there is. This legend has been told. Subscribe and return to Aeonkeep. More legends await.